بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين وبعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Alright, here we are once again, Bidāyat al-ʿābid wa kifāyat al-zahd by the great Abdurrahman al-Ba'li rahimahullah ta'ala, al-Shaykh al-Imam al-Mu'allif. He is now going to push into a couple of important topics to close up the chapter on Ramadan or Siyam Ramadan. Today we're looking at, or in this session, class number 17, we're looking at expiations for breaking the fast for multiple different purposes. We're also going to be talking about some voluntary fasting, rules pertaining to that, and then we will look at Iʿtikāf, which will wrap up this particular chapter. He begins here in this section, he says, وَمَنْ جَمَعَ فِي نَهَارِ رَمَضَانَ فِي قُبُلٍ أَوْ دُبُرٍ وَلَوْ لِمَيْتٍ أَوْ بَهِيمَةٍ فِي حَالَةٍ يَلْزَمَهُ فِيهَا الْإِمْسَاكِ مُكْرَهًا كَانَ أَوْ نَاسِيًا لَزِمَهُ الْقَضَاءُ وَالْكَفَّارَةُ وَهَكَذَا مَنْ جُمِعَ إِنْ طَاوَعَ غَيْرَ جَاهِلٍ وَنَاسٍ ومن جامع في يوم ثم في آخرة ولم يكفر لزمته ثانية كمن أعاده في يومه بعد أن كفر ولا كفارة بغير الجماع والإنزال بالمساحقة نهار رمضان وهي إتق رقبة مؤمنة سليمة فإن لم يجد فصيام شهرين متتابعين فإن لم يستطيع فإطعام 60 مسكينا فإن لم يجد سقطت بخلاف كفارة حج أو ظهار أو يمين. So here he says, whoever has intercourse during the daytime of Ramadan, whether vaginal or anal, even with a deceased person or an animal, in a state in which abstention is obligatory, meaning fasting that is, whether compelled or forgetful, must make up the fast and offer expiation. The same applies to one who is the recipient of intercourse if they consented and were neither ignorant nor forgetful. Whoever has intercourse on one day and again on another day, performing expiation is required to offer a second expiation, just as one who repeats it within a single day after having already offered expiation. There is no expiation for anything other than intercourse or ejaculation resulting from lesbian acts during the daytime of Ramadan. The expiation is to free a sound, believing slave. If that is not possible, then fasting 2 consecutive months. If unable to do so, feeding 64 persons. If none of these can be fulfilled, the obligation is waived, unlike the expiations of Hajj, Zihar, or oaths, which remain due. Okay, so this section deals with the most serious invalidators of fasting in Ramadan, which have to do with sexual intercourse. Some of that would be considered permissible outside of Ramadan, and some of what he mentions is obviously impermissible, some of it being rather repugnant. However, the scholars of the legal tradition discuss these various scenarios because they are things that unfortunately occur, and they must be addressed. How to handle them, even when somebody is fasting. That's right. We live a very unique existence, dichotomies at times, living one way or living 2 ways at one time, where one person might be observing a fast, but then engages in such an impermissible deed. So here we're talking about, after discussing in the previous section multiple things that break the fast, here he highlights that if a person has intercourse it doesn't matter, vaginally or anally, during the day in Ramadan, their fast is broken. And there are two things that are required due to that. First is making up the fast. The next is kaffara, which is a specific expiation. It needs to be noted here that the person also needs to make tawbah. Repentance is required if they are committing a sin. So intentionally breaking your fast in Ramadan is sinful. And then on top of that, what this act entails could require an even greater level of repentance if the act in and of itself is impermissible. So this intercourse applies even when it's with a spouse, when it would typically be permissible. Because in the daylight of Ramadan, it becomes impermissible to engage in such activity. And of course, that extends beyond the spouse, like someone you're not married to. He mentions a deceased person or even an animal. And obviously those things there, those last three that I mentioned there, are impermissible in and of themselves. The person who is forced or coerced, if you will, who is forgetful or mistaken, thinking it was night or thinking that it was not Ramadan. The person had broken their fast earlier in the day, for example, thinking it was Sha'ban, but later it was confirmed that it was actually Ramadan. This all applies even in those cases. And this also extends to the person that is, as he describes, the recipient, the one who is being engaged with. So in this case, the other party, which would be more than likely the wife or the female involved, if they were to consent to this, and they were not ignorant of the ruling or forgetful, then that recipient, in most cases, her or she too is responsible for both the makeup and the expiation, if she consents. So the woman is treated the same as the man in this case, even if we were to describe her as being on the receiving end of that act. But if she consented to it, it means she's an active participant in the deed itself, and she's violated the sanctity of the fast knowingly. He also touches on an important point about the kaffara being repeated. In what cases do you have to pay more than one time? So you have to pay more than one kaffara, for example, if you'd had intercourse on 2 different days of Ramadan. 2 different days would require 2 different expiations. As we understand, each day is an individual act or duty. Regardless if you hadn't paid the kaffara yet. So if you're thinking, I'll just wait and see what happens at the end of Ramadan, and we'll just pay 1 for every infraction, you have to look at each day. In the event that there were multiple days in which this was committed, then you have to add up those days and pay a kaffara which is suitable to cover all of those infractions. Or, for example, if it's done twice in one day, and the kaffara had already been paid for the first, then you have to offer a second one. So this is one day is some detail to it, in that a person may fall into this error, this sin, one time, let's say for example, earlier in the day. If they go and pay the kaffara immediately, and then they are guilty of the same infraction on the same day, just later on, they now have to pay it again. Because the first kaffara essentially was there to take care of that act, the initial one, and so now it's like there's no points on the board, no points against them on the board, just to keep a tally. And so they engaged on the second time in the same day, then they would pay a second kaffara. If on the same day they didn't pay for their first kaffara and then they fell into the act again, then for that day, it would only be one kaffara in total, one expiation that they would have to pay for the entirety of that day. Essentially because they didn't, if we were to use this language, they didn't reset the day with a kaffara, but they acted in this manner more than one time, then they would do what they needed to cover for the day and not for each given act on that day. It's only when it's reset or the point against them is removed that they would now have to offer a second expiation for that single day. What does the kaffara consist of? He highlights this. And this is mentioned in the famous hadith of the Bedouin who approached the Prophet ﷺ after having committed or having had relations with his wife during Ramadan. And this goes in order. So the first is freeing a believing bondservant or slave, one who is sound in terms of their health and capacity. So they would have to free that bondservant as an act of expiation for this infraction. And if one does not exist or is not available, then they would have to fast for 2 consecutive months, one after the other, one day after the other without taking a break. If they're unable to do that, there's a legal excuse for them being excused from such a kaffara. It's a lack of capacity, not a lack of desire. Then they would have to feed 60 needy people, each receiving 1 mud of wheat or half a sa'a of something else, as we've discussed previously. And then if a person cannot do or cannot afford any of these 3 in that consecutive order, there's nothing left to do. The obligation is essentially waived. It's dropped. And he mentions, and this is unlike the kaffara for mistakes made during Hajj or dhihar, which is when you pronounce dhihar against your spouse, your wife, making her impermissible for you to lie with. And in that case, you offer an expiation before you can begin again. And so that is not waived. That must be fulfilled in those cases, or oaths and things of that nature. He does not mention any other sexual acts that would invalidate the fast besides engaging in what is known as musahaqa, which is essentially a climax resulting from lesbian endeavor. Again, not necessarily addressing the ruling of such behavior. We understand that to be haram as well, just like 2 men together, 2 women being together in this sexual way is impermissible. However, he's addressing the nature of the fast and its validity when those things are committed. So in this case, their fast would be invalidated, no doubt, and would require an expiation. Other acts that could result in climax, sexual climax, like masturbation or kissing or touching, foreplay, those types of things, even if they lead to ejaculation, they do not require kaffara. They would invalidate the fast, of course, and require a person to make it up. It's just in these cases you would not have to follow that order of freeing a bondservant, fasting 2 months, or feeding 64 people. Special notes here is that expiation for this act is not required if one has intercourse while traveling. We've talked about traveling being an excuse for a person to break their fast. Fasting is not required during travel. So that's something to take note in. So what we could conclude with this particular portion is the stern nature of the penalty or the penitence of this, from this infraction. It may appear to be very severe, that you would have to free a bondservant to fast 60 days or 2 months and feed 64 people. it should serve as a reminder of the sanctity of Ramadan. It's a very special time that must be revered and sanctified. Breaking the fast is no light matter, especially when it comes to this type of act. And so the servant of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala should show deep reverence and be aware that these acts are not merely private sins, but they break the essential covenant of submission during sacred time. The next section he says, وَسُنَّ تَعْجِيلُ فِطْرٍ وَتَأْخِيرُ سُحُورٍ وقول ما ورد عند فطر ومن فاته رمضان قضى عدد أيامه ويسن على الفور إلا إذا بقي من شعبان بقدر ما عليه فيجب ولا يصح ابتداء تطوع من عليه قضاء رمضان فإن نوى صوما واجبا أو قضاء ثم قلبه نفلا صح ويحرم تأخير قضاء رمضان إلى آخر بلا عذر فإن فعل وجب مع القضاء إطعام مسكين عن كل يوم وإن مات المفرط ولو قبل آخر أطعم عنه كذلك من رأس ماله ولا يصام عنه. Okay, so this section is talking about a number of other important rulings here. It's recommended to hasten the breaking of the fast, to delay the pre-dawn meal, and to say the supplication transmitted or the time of breaking the fast. Whoever has missed days of Ramadan must make up an equal number of days. It is recommended to do so promptly, except when there remains from Sha'ban only the number of days equal to what is owed. Then it becomes obligatory. It is not valid for one who owes make-up fast of Ramadan to begin a voluntary fast. If one intends an obligatory fast or a make-up fast and then changes it to a voluntary one, it is valid. It is impermissible to delay making up Ramadan until the next without an excuse, and if one does so, it becomes obligatory, along with making up the fast to feed a poor person for every day. If one who delayed dies even before the following, feeding a poor person for each missed day must be given from their estate. Fasting on their behalf is not to be done. So, a couple of important rulings here. Number one, he mentions the recommendation of hastening to break the fast. And this is a teaching of the Prophet ﷺ. So once the sun has set, it's recommended to break the fast without delay. This doesn't mean being quick in consuming food to break the fast without certainty that the sun has set. Right? You're moments ahead and you're like, let's hurry up and eat it, and you're not certain that the sun has set and the day is over. The foundation is that what is established with certainty remains until certainty establishes that it has ended. So we act during the daytime, even as the sun's getting ready to set, based on what we know is certain, and that is, it is still day. So we cannot act in order to break the fast based on assumption. If we were to say certainty is the highest level and assumption is lower than that, we cannot dethrone certainty with assumption. Certainty must be established in order to break the fast. So the hastening to break the fast means once certainty is established, then you should make haste in breaking the fast, as opposed to delaying it for an unnecessary reason. Like, I'm going to delay breaking my fast so that I can pray first. Rather, you should break your fast, even if it's with something small or seemingly insignificant, a sip of water, a date, something very basic. Break your fast. And then if you want to take care of some business, like you want to pray, which of course is recommended, you don't sit there and eat an entire meal, which could take you up to half an hour or longer, and then you're having to rest, and then you got to do dessert, and then you got to do tea, and then you got to do coffee, and the next thing you know, you're pushing up against Isha prayer. Right? So the idea is, have something quickly. It's the sunnah of the Prophet to break the fast with haste, and not to, again, not to do that based on assumption. There's a spiritual wisdom behind this hastening to break the fast. And that, of course, is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves those of His servants who hasten to obey Him, who are quick to obey Him. And because fasting is a form of obedience, along with breaking the fast being a form of obedience, then hastening is a means by which a person draws closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The Prophet ﷺ also said, the people will continue to be upon good so long as they hasten to break the fast. The other recommendation, he says, delaying suhoor. As we know, suhoor is the pre-dawn meal. It's done before the fast commences in the morning time. It should be delayed to just before Fajr, as long as there's no fear in missing the time. The Prophet ﷺ, he described suhoor as the best meal. He said, do not skip it. So even a small amount would suffice for this meal, like a sip of water or a date or something simple. This would earn the reward of fulfilling this recommendation. And delaying it, there's wisdom in that. It's not just devotional in nature, but when you delay your suhoor, it strengthens you for the fast. And it shows that you're taking full benefit of the allowances afforded to you by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You're afforded certain allowances, that is, to eat during the night. And by pushing that up, in terms pushing it towards the Fajr time, as opposed to having, if Fajr time comes in at 5 a.m., but you're having your suhoor like 1 a.m. or 2, you delay that until we get close to the time. You're taking full advantage of those allowances by extending the scope of time in which you're eating. Right, so it is recommended to delay the suhoor based on the Prophet's practice as well as his instruction. You can find in Sahih al-Bukhari, the companion Zayd ibn Thabit radiallahu anhu, he said, we ate suhoor with the Prophet, then he got up to pray. He was asked, how much time was there between the two? And he replied, enough time to recite 50 verses. So this is highlighting a best practice. How close do we get to the time for Fajr? Here, enough time for 50 verses. And that is often estimated to be about 10 to 15 minutes, depending on the recitation speed and the length of the verses. But on average, 10 to 15 minutes. And so this is a practical takeaway for us to know when to stop eating. To eat as close to the adhan of Fajr as possible. The adhan of Fajr, not the prayer of Fajr. The prayer obviously comes in after fasting is commenced. If you're eating and the Fajr adhan is already gone, you've ruined the day. You'll have to continue to fast the rest of the day. You'll just have to be made up. So the sunnah is to get close to that time, but there is no real fixed, firm time within the legal texts. But from this hadith, we can understand that there's a brief time period, around 10 to 15 minutes between the suhoor and the start of the fast. And so this is a good practice, safety protocol to avoid getting, you get close but not too close, where you start to dibble and dabble into doubt. Especially when you're relying upon clocks, you're relying upon charts, you're relying upon apps, instead of relying upon observational cues. Like if you're not observing it with the eye, you're relying upon calculations. And the calculations, while they're very helpful, oftentimes are not 100% accurate. And so those are there for kind of, they should be understood as a general timing. This is as close as we can calculate, but it might not be exact with the observational cues. And so that, again, that little window of time is a very good practice to observe. Another thing that he mentions is supplication at the time of breaking the fast. There are multiple supplications reported from the Prophet ﷺ, and so reciting a multitude of those, one or more, or alternating between those various different du'as that are made by the Prophet ﷺ is highly recommended as well. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, the fasting person has a du'a that is not rejected at the time of breaking their fast. This is in Sunnah ibn Majah. Right, so you take advantage of these moments in which the du'a, the likelihood of it being accepted, is increased tremendously. And so breaking the fast at that moment is one of those precious times. The next thing he did talk about was making up fasts of Ramadan, qada. So here we're looking at how you would handle making up the missed days, whether they were one or more. So if someone missed a fast of Ramadan, whether it was due to the legal excuses like travel or sickness, for women, for menstruation, or pregnancy, or another valid excuse that they might have, they're obliged to make up the exact number of days that they missed. And this also extends to a person that sinfully broke their fast. So in the event that you have no excuse, you just decide, I'm not going to fast today, I want to take a little break, or I don't want to participate. It's sinful, so not only do you have to make up the fast, but you also have to make tawbah. You have to repent from that sin. And this, of course, is based in the Quran when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَعِدَّةٌ مِّنْ أَيَّامٍ أُخَرٍ, that you have to essentially calculate the time period and make them up during other days. It's recommended to make up the fast immediately after Ramadan. After the day of Eid is over, it's recommended to now begin making up those fasts, because fulfilling your obligations as soon as possible. We've been talking about earlier the nature of making haste, being quick to righteousness, whether it is an obligation or a recommendation. So it's recommended to make haste in fulfilling this obligation. As we understand, you have time to make it up, but the sooner you get it done, the better, because essentially what you're doing is you are relieving yourself of that moral duty. You're getting it done. And it's not hanging in the balance with the potential that you could pass away with fasts that you neglected. So while it is permissible to delay a bit, it's recommended to make haste. It's also permissible to spread out the days if needed. So if you have multiple days, let's say, for example, you have a week, 7 days to make up. While it's encouraged to quickly make them up after Eid, one after the other, you can delay and you can separate the days. You can fast 1 day a week or 1 day a month to make up those missed days. But you cannot delay too long, such that you run into the next Ramadan. So if you have 7 days, we go back to this example, it's recommended to make them in haste, permissible to delay, but then it becomes an obligation for you to fast them 7 days out of Ramadan. You have 7 days left until Ramadan starts. Now you're obliged to make up those days before the next Ramadan begins. So that's an obligation. And what we're saying here is, if now you do not fulfill that obligation, you've become sinful for not making up those days. And when you do not do that without an excuse, you don't have a legal excuse not to make them up, you have to feed one poor person per day as an expiation for not making them up on time, along with making them up after the Ramadan that you're now entering upon. And then if you die before making them up, and you had no excuse for the delay, your estate, meaning whatever money that you left behind or wealth, must be utilized before distribution in order to feed one poor person per day that you missed. So that will come out of your estate before your inheritors receive their shares. If you had an excuse and you died, like you had a continuous illness that you couldn't get over, or traveling, etc., whatever it may be, if there was an excuse and you died before making them up, then there would be no expiation to be paid. The obligation is lifted due to your inability. Someone dies while owing missed days, not of Ramadan, but let's say days that they should have fasted otherwise. You can't substitute fast to, or you can't pass on fasts to another person. Unless the nature of the fast was not obligatory in its very essence. But you, by way of, for example, an oath or a vow, like another, that's a vow. You made a vow to fast. It now elevates the level of that fast to being something that's required. And so in this case, someone can fast on your behalf. So they couldn't fast on your behalf for what is intrinsically obligatory, like Ramadan, or a make-up Ramadan. They can't fast for you in that case. But they could in the event that you took what would be normally a sunnah fast and you elevated, or I should say, you escalated the ruling of it to being obligatory for you alone based on a vow that you made. Like, I swear to Allah, I'm going to fast on one day out of the year. You make it an obligation. Then they can take that obligation on themselves as the ways to cover you. And this is based on a hadith found in Sahih al-Bukhari and Muslim. If your mother had a debt, wouldn't you pay it off? Then fast on her behalf. And so that distinguishes between the two acts. And this also includes vowed fast, and the same applies to vowed prayers or the Hajj or other acts of worship. As long as they were optional acts made obligatory by a vow, then someone can take them on and make them up for you after you've passed away. Another thing that's important to note about this issue of making up fast is, can I fast? This is a normal question that happens every year. Can I fast sunnah days while I still owe missed Ramadan days? Like the 6 days of Shawwal. Can I start those while I still have days to make up? And the answer is no. You cannot initiate voluntary fasts while you still owe obligatory fasts. It's much like the prayer we've discussed previously. The prayer that you've missed, obligatory prayers, you're not permitted. In fact, they don't even count the nafila mutlaqa to begin a general voluntary prayer. It doesn't even count in this case because you haven't made up your obligations. And the fast is the same way. The fast requires you to fulfill the Ramadan days that were missed before you can embark upon these extra voluntary fasts. So you have to fast the days that you missed, and then you can begin with extra fasts. So basically we're looking at prioritizing our obligations over the extra acts of devotion. The next section, he says, يُسَنُّ صَوْمُ التَّطَوُّعِ صَوْمُ التَّطَوُّعِ وَأَفْضَلُهُ يَوْمٌ وَيَوْمٌ وَصَوْمُ ثَلَاثَةٍ مِنْ كُلِّ شَهْرٍ وَأَيَّامَ الْبِيضِ أفضل ثلاثة, he says, ويوم ويوم وصوم ثلاثة من كل شهر وأيام البيض أفضل وهي 13 و14 و15 والخميس والاثنين وست من شوال والأولى تتابعها وعقب العيد وصائمها مع رمضان كأنما صام الدهر وصوم المحرم وآكده العاشر وهو كفارة سنة ثم التاسع وعشر ذي الحجة وآكده يوم عرفة وهو كفارة سنتين. Next section is about voluntary fasting, after we've discussed the obligatory fasting. Voluntary fasting is recommended. The best of it is fasting every other day. Meaning the best voluntary fast is yawmun wa yawm. 1 day on, 1 day off. Then fasting 3 days of each month. The white days, ayyam al-bid, being best. The 13th, 14th, and 15th. Then fasting Thursdays and Mondays. Then 6 days of Shawwal, preferably consecutive after Eid. For whoever fasts them along with Ramadan, it is though they have fasted the whole year. Then fasting in Muharram. The most emphasized being the 10th, which expiates a year. Then the 9th. Then the 10 days of Dhul Hijjah. The most emphasized day, the most emphasized being the day of Arafah, which expiates 2 years. Many of us are very familiar with these recommended days. Voluntary fasts are tremendously rewarding. Keeping the servant spiritually active and engaged, increasing their level of piety and strengthening their shield against sin and illicit behavior. Fasting is a very powerful spiritual exercise. And the best, as he mentions, is known as Siyam Dawood, alayhi salam, the fast of every other day. And the great masters of the tradition, they have insights into why this is so powerful, as opposed to fasting 1 day after the other. So one might think, well, if I wanted to, I could fast a lot more if I just fasted days straight, one after the other. And that seems like it might be more rewarding. I could just get going on a nice run of fasts. Fasting through an entire month, for example, beyond Ramadan, can be done. But Siyam Dawood is noted for its spiritual power due to the fact that you keep the body in jeopardy. If you note in Ramadan, by the 3rd day, typically, you're in a routine. Fasting becomes rather easy. The routine of it, the body adapts. It gets used to a new diet and schedule of eating. Even at times, the sleep becomes something in which you can manage. The sleep schedule changes. You adapt to these things, the body. But when you fast 1 day and then you break the fast, you do not develop the momentum that the body needs in order to become accustomed to a new diet or a new schedule. And so you're constantly putting the body in a moment of jeopardy. It's not sure. The body can't adjust. So what keeps you in that routine of fasting requires full devotion, not routine. And when you're fully devoted, fully present, the intention is constantly on the mind, and so the fast will typically carry much more meaning, and based on the sacrifice that's being made, more reward. Much more has been said about the topic of Siyam Dawood, 1 day on, 1 day off, but in summary, that gives you an idea as to why he mentions the best is to fast every other day, due to the physical and spiritual rigor of the exercise. And then, of course, we understand the other days well and good. Most of us are accustomed to these days, 3 days a month. The white days of those 3 being best. 13th and 14th and 15th, this, of course, is of the lunar calendar based on the moon sighting. And then Mondays and Thursdays were a regular practice of the Prophet ﷺ. Monday is Yawmul Ithnain. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, it's the day that I was born. Right? And so he fasted on the day that he was born. 6 days of Shawwal, of course, we've understood that. And consecutive fast after Eid for Ramadan. It is a reward for the entire year. So if we were to say 30 days in Ramadan, and al-hasana bi'ashari amthaliha, right? The one good deed is equivalent to 10. So 30 days times 10 gives you 300. And then 6 days after that times 10 give you 60. And there you have about a year. A reward for an entire year, as if you fasted the whole year. So on and so forth. He goes on and he says, وَكُرِهَ إِفْرَادُ رَجَبٍ وَالْجُمْعَةِ وَالسَّبْتِ بِصَوْمٍ وَصَوْمُ يَوْمِ شَكٍّ وهو 30 من شعبان إذا لم يكن حين التراء علة وصوم يوم النيروز والمهرجان وكل عيد للكفار أو يوم يفردونه بتعظيم وتقدم رمضان بيوم أو يومين إلا أن يوافق عادة في الكل. It's disliked to single out Rajab, Friday or Saturday for fasting, or the day of doubt, the 30th of Sha'ban, when there is no cause for obstruction at the time of sighting, or to fast on the days of Nayruz, Mahrajan, or any festival of the disbelievers, or any day they uniquely venerate. It is also disliked to precede Ramadan by 1 or 2 days unless it coincides with one's regular fasting habit. Fil kulli, meaning for all of those mentioned, unless it coincides with one's regular fasting habit. So the scholars mentioned that there are certain fasts, while not strictly forbidden, are disliked. Notice he begins this with وَكُرِهَ إِفْرَادُ رَجَبٍ وَالْجُمَّةِ وَالسَّبْتِ بِصَوْمٍ to the end of this section here. It's disliked due to their resemblance or problematic practices or deviation from the prophetic pattern. Singling out specific days. For example, or fasts alone, like Rajab, fasting the entire month of Rajab, singling it out regularly is discouraged. Noted by the Prophet ﷺ. Fasting on Friday also, he noted that as being something discouraged. Saturday as well. And you can remove the nature of this ruling by associating it with a subsequent fast, or a fast immediately prior to. So if you wanted to fast on Friday, it's disliked, meaning you could do it, it's valid, it's disliked. But if you wanted to remove that level of being disliked, you would associate a day with it. So Thursday and Friday, or Friday and Saturday, you would combine a day. Or singling out Rajab, so maybe 1 month before and 1 month after. It would remove that act of being disliked. The day of doubt, Yom HaShek, we've discussed this when starting Ramadan. This is the 30th of Sha'ban, when the sky is clear. When the sky is not clear and obstructed, then the 30th is the day you have to fast, yajib. It's an obligation to fast that day as a precautionary measure. But when there's no obstruction in the sky and the moon wasn't sighted, the next day is Yom Shek. That's what they call that. And so it's impermissible, or excuse me, it's disliked to fast on that Yom Shek. Also, he mentions other things, non-Muslim holidays, their religious festivals. He mentions Nayruz and Mahrajan. These are the a'yad of other peoples. That you're not to fast, is disliked to fast on their holidays, as it serves as a form of veneration. And also, you're trying to avoid resembling them in other religious practices. And then you have fasting right before Ramadan, the 28th or 29th of Sha'ban. This is also discouraged. And another thing to note is what's called wisal. This is not in the text, but I thought I'd throw this in there. Wisal is a continuous fast, where you fast without breaking it, even like to break the fast at all. There's no iftar, there's no suhoor, meaning you make wisal all the way through from the night, the morning. You're fasting day and night, is wisal. And the Prophet ﷺ fasted this way at times for long durations, a month maybe. That's right. Nothing. We saw it all the way. And some of the companions noted this and they wanted to do it as well. They wanted to make a continuous fast. And he told them not to. Unless it was just one day, to fast until Suhoor of the next day. That was permitted. Permitted to do that, though better to refrain, to delay the iftar until Suhoor of the next day. So you start at Suhoor and then you end at the next Suhoor. That would be the wisal that was permitted. But to go multiple days like this is discouraged. The Prophet ﷺ, he's discouraged this because he said that I am being given food and drink from Allah. Allah is the one that's providing me with the food and drink. Quite amazing. But it strikes at the very heart of an issue that I pointed out a couple of sessions ago about the fact that these things, like the example I highlighted was fire burning, in that the fire is a sabab min al-asbab. It's just a means. And to believe that the fire is the thing that burns is to place too much power within the fire itself. But the fire is just a means by which Allah is the one that burns. Like the sword is the means by which Allah cuts. Imam Abdul Qadir al-Jilani goes on to extend that and says, and the food is just the means by which Allah nourishes. So just like the fire Ibrahim was thrown into, alayhi salam, and came out unburned. You see? If the fire had the power to burn, he would have been burned. But because Allah is the one that burns by the fire, he uses the sabab as he wills, as he wishes to employ that. He can take that thing and say, it's not going to have an effect. Because Allah is the one that actually does, and he's the outcome is by him, Azza wa Jal. And so here, this is highlighting that same concept. The Prophet ﷺ is being fed and provided drink from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala without the sabab. Yeah. A person could. And it's found in multiple, not only in the Sunnah of the Prophet, but also in the Quran. About harvest, for example. Are you the ones that harvested, or are we the ones that harvest? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at the end of all of that, right? And so that's just a spiritual insight into this topic, which wasn't mentioned there by the great Imam al-Ba'li. However, that is one of the fasts, a continuous fast called wisal, in which it is discouraged besides the permissible scenario which I highlighted. And then, of course, at the end, I think it's important to note, while these days are disliked, he says, إِلَّا أَن يُوَافِقَ عَادَةً فِي الْكُلِّ, unless they coincide with one's regular fasting habit. So, for example, in the event that the fast occurred, for example, the non-Muslim holiday occurred on a Monday in which you normally fast, then you maintain your normal fast, your habitual fast. Right? If the 13th, 14th, and 15th, the Ayyam al-Bid occurred on a particular seasonal holiday, then you would observe your fast because that's something that you normally do. It's obvious that you're not singling out that day for that moment or that occasion, but this is your normal habit. I fast on these days regularly, and this isn't something that could be attributed to you or your fast. Oh, he's just fasting because he's He's into these people. He's into their thing, and he's just trying to participate in some form or fashion. Well, they're fasting on Lent, so I'm going to fast on Lent to show some solidarity. Unless that happened in Ramadan, or on days in which you normally fasted, then no, akhi, you don't have nothing to do with Lent. You don't have anything to do with those people's fast, and you don't venerate what they're doing. All right, so that's the concept here. It's disliked to be engaged in that way. It says, وَلَا يَصِحُّ صَوْمُ أَيَّامِ التَّشْرِيقِ إِلَّا عَنْ دَمِ مُتْعَةٍ أَوْ قِرَانٍ وَلَا صَوْمُ عِيدٍ مُطْلَقًا وَيَحْرُمُ وَمَنْ دَخَلَ فِي التَّطَوُّعِ غَيْرِ حَجٍّ أَوْ أُمْرَةٍ لَمْ يَجِبْ إِتْمَامُهُ وَيُسَنُّ وَإِنْ فَسَدَ وَيُسَنُّ. Right? It says, لَمْ يَجِبْ إِتْمَامُهُ وَيُسَنُّ وَإِنْ فَسَدَ فَلَا قَضَاءَ وَيَجِبُ إِتْمَامُ فَرْضٍ مُطْلَقًا وَلَوْ مُوَسَّعًا كَصَلَاةٍ وَقَضَاءِ رَمَضَانٍ وَنَذْرٍ مُطْلَقٍ وَكَفَّارَةٍ وَإِنْ بَطَلَ فَلَا مَزِيدَ وَلَا كَفَّارَةَ. He says here, fasting the days of Tashriq is not valid except for one offering a compensatory sacrifice of mut'ah or qiran. Fasting on Eid is absolutely invalid and forbidden. Whoever begins a voluntary act other than Hajj or Umrah is not obliged to complete it, though it is recommended. وَمَنْ دَخَلَ فِي تَطَوُّعٍ غَيْرِ حَجٍّ أَوْ أُمْرَةٍ لَمْ يَجِبْ إِتْمَامُهُ وَيُسَنُّ. That's the line right there. Whoever begins a voluntary act غَيْرِ حَجٍّ أَوْ أُمْرَةٍ, other than Hajj or Umrah, is not obligated to complete it, though it's recommended. If it becomes invalid, it is not required to be made up. It is obligatory to complete any compulsory act, absolutely, even if its time is extensive, such as prayer, making up Ramadan, an unrestricted vow, or an expiation. If such an act is invalidated, there is nothing further required and no expiation. So first he opens up with the Ayyam Tashriq. This is 11th, 12th, and 13th of Dhul Hijjah. This is the days after Eid. It's not valid to fast during the 3 days after Eid al-Adha, called Ayyam Tashriq, unless a person is performing Hajj Tamattu or Qiran and cannot afford the sacrificial animal. Then they may fast these three days instead as a substitute for that animal that they would sacrifice. Tashriq, the Ayyam Tashriq, is a time of eating, drinking, and remembering Allah. So fasting is generally avoided unless you're a pilgrim making up for a missed sacrifice. Also the 2 days of Eid, this should be obvious to us. Eid al-Fitr and Eid al-Adha, absolutely invalid and forbidden to fast. Whether this is a voluntary fast or an obligatory fast, these days as well are meant to be for celebration, joy, and gratitude, not refraining and abstaining from food and drink. Then he highlights some rules regarding completing voluntary versus obligatory fast. So voluntary fast or worship, voluntary worship, other than Hajj or Umrah. So if you begin a voluntary fast or any other voluntary act, you're not required to complete it. So that means you could fast in the morning time. You start your voluntary fast. You say, Monday, I'm going to get up and I'm going to fast. And you start. And then by 11 or 12 in the afternoon, you realize, yeah, I just can't maintain this. Or I'm invited now. Somebody invited me, and I don't want to refuse and deny them, so I'm going to break my fast for their sake. You break it in that case. Your voluntary fast is not an obligation to maintain. You're not required. It's recommended to do so for consistency, obviously, to conclude, وَلَا تُبْطِلُوا أَعْمَالَكُمْ. You don't want to intentionally invalidate your good deeds. So it's recommended to maintain, but permissible to break, especially if there is a genuine haja. You might have a need. If a voluntary fast becomes invalid, meaning you broke the fast, not that you just said, I'm going to stop fasting, you broke it with one of the acts that break fast, you don't have to make it up. Voluntary Hajj or Umrah, if you start a voluntary Hajj or Umrah, you must complete it, just like an obligatory one. Once you get into Ihram, You cannot get out until you fulfill the rites and rituals. Obligatory acts, they must be completed as he mentioned, whether the obligation is fixed, one fixed within the Sharia. We know obligations like Salah and fasting, Ramadan, those are obligations in and of themselves. It doesn't require anything else to be obligatory. Or if you take a vow or an oath of sorts in which you impose an act upon yourself. Again, you escalate the issue from being voluntary or recommended to now being an obligation. That must also be concluded. And once started, it must be completed without excuse. So these examples are like make-up fast for Ramadan, make-up prayers that you might have missed. These are obligatory prayers. Unrestricted vows or fast for prayers, or a vow for a prayer. All of those types of things have to be completed. And while these things are not time sensitive, typically, once you start them, they must be finished because they are obligations. The next section here, concluding this part of the chapter, وَأَفْضَلُ الْأَيَّامِ يَوْمُ الْجُمْعَةِ وَأَفْضَلُ الليالي ليلة القدر وتطلب في العشر الأخير من رمضان وأوتاره آكد وأرجاها سابعه ويكثر من دعائه فيها اللهم إنك عفو تحب العفو فاعف عني. The best day of days, or the best of days, is Friday. That's the best day of the week. And the best of nights is Laylatul Qadr. It is sought in the last 10 nights of Ramadan, especially in the odd ones, and the 7th being most hopeful, meaning the 7th of the last 10, which would be the 27th. One should increase in supplication during it, saying, "O Allah, indeed you are pardoning. Allahumma innaka afuwun tuhibbul afwa fa'fu anni." It's a very famous dua that's made in the last 10 nights. "O Allah, you are pardoning, you love to pardon, so pardon me." The last section we're going to look at here is فَصْلٌ وَالْإِعْتِكَافُ سُنَّةٌ كُلَّ وَقْتٍ وَفِي رَمَضَانَ آكَدُ وَآكَدُهُ عَشْرُهُ الْأَخِيرُ وَيَجِبُ بِنَذْرٍ وَشُرِطَ لَهُ نِيَّةٌ وَإِسْلَامٌ وَعَقْلٌ وَتَمْيِيزٌ وَعَدَمُ مَا يُوجِبُ الْغُسْلَ وَكَوْنُهُ بِمَسْجِدٍ ويزاد في حق من تلزمه الجماعة أن يكون المسجد مما تقام فيه ومن المسجد ما زيد فيه ومنه ظهره ورحبته المحوطة ومنارته التي هي أوبابها فيه. Itikaf is the conclusion of this chapter of fasting. Itikaf is a recommended act at all times, and more emphasized in Ramadan, most emphasized in its last 10 days. It becomes obligatory by a vow. Its conditions are intention, Islam, sanity, discernment, and freedom from that which necessitates ghusl. It must take place in a masjid, and for one obliged to attend congregational prayer, it must be a masjid in which it is established. The masjid includes any added extensions, its roof, its enclosed courtyard, and its minaret if it or its entrance is within it, within the masjid that is. So itikaf, we understand, most of us, this is a means to remain in, this act means that you remain in the masjid for the purpose of worship and devotion. Worship and devotion. That you remain in the masjid for the purposes of worship and devotion, not as your mobile office. You just move your home office into the masjid now. So the work I'm doing at home is now being transferred over to the masjid. Or your main social center becomes your social center. We used to hang out at my house in Ramadan in the first 20 nights, and now we're going to shift that into the masjid, and it's going to be a social place where we're going to play ball, we're going to shoot the breeze, we're going to play some cards, we're going to watch some shows, going to be on our phones, going on the socials, etc. No, it's meant to be an opportunity to remain secluded in the masjid without distraction so that you can embark upon worship and devotion. And it's not just restricted to Ramadan. It's any time. Itikaf can be made any time. It's most emphasized in Ramadan, especially in the last 10 nights. And it becomes an obligation if someone were to make a vow to perform itikaf. Then he mentions some of the conditions, Muslims saying of discerning age, free of ritual impurity, major ritual impurity like janaba or menstruation. And it also must be in a masjid, not like your home or elsewhere. It has to be in a masjid. And if you are responsible for attending the congregational prayer, that masjid must be one in which the congregational prayer is established. And then you could leave potentially if that masjid, congregational masjid, doesn't offer the Jummah prayer. If you're also obliged to attend Jummah prayer, then in that case you'd have to leave to go and attend the Jummah prayer, or you'd have to be in the masjid that offers both the obligatory and Jummah prayer throughout the weeks. And so that's something to take into consideration. Now, if you're not obliged to attend Jummah prayer, then you can make itikaf in any masjid. For example, if you're a woman or if you're a traveler, then you can maintain your itikaf in a masjid, and you wouldn't have to go out for Jummah prayer. Women are allowed to make itikaf in the masjid. There should be designated space for them. Not in their home musalla, right? That's not making itikaf. They might have a dedicated room at their house where they pray or they read Quran or whatever. That's not itikaf. Itikaf happens in the masjid. And in order for a woman to do this, if she's married, she has to seek her husband's permission, because she'll be basically leaving him and unable to fulfill his rights for a recommended act. Prioritization. She will not be able to fulfill his rights, which is an obligation, in order to fulfill a recommendation. Right? So you have to take the consideration of priorities. So the woman here in this case would need for her husband to relinquish those rights by giving her permission to go do this for multiple days, or even for multiple hours, depending on the husband's needs. The husband's needs could be immediate. And if the husband's needs are immediate, then the duty is immediate. The obligation becomes imminent, that must be fulfilled right away. Cannot be delayed. Then he talks about the masjid in various areas that count as a part of the mu'takaf, or the place in which you can make itikaf. The main prayer hall, obviously, the rooftop as well. An enclosed courtyard is a part of the masjid for this. The minaret, meaning you could be in the minaret, or its entrance, if it's within the boundary of the masjid. There might be like a minaret that's off-site or outside. It's not attached to the masjid, it's not a part of it. But it has to be a part of it, like, you know, you can get into the masjid from there. Or if there's new extensions into the building or added onto the building, as long as they've been integrated into the masjid, then they are also included in those places. He says, وَمَنْ نَظَرَ الْإِعْتِكَافَ أَوْ الصَّلَاةَ فِي مَسْجِدٍ غَيْرِ الثَّلَاثَةِ فَلَهُ فِعْلُهُ فِي غَيْرِهِ وَفِي أَحَدِهَا فَلَهُ فِعْلُهُ فِيهِ وَفِي الْأَفْضَلِ مِنْهُ وَأَفْضَلُهَا الْمَسْجِدُ الْحَرَامِ ثُمَّ مَسْجِدُ النَّبِيِّ ثُمَّ الْأَقْصَى. So whoever vows to perform itikaf or pray in a masjid other than the three is permitted to do so in another. Man nadhara al-i'tikaf aw as-salata fi masjidin ghayr al-thalathati falahu fi'luhu fi ghayrihi. That they're talking about fulfilling an oath or a vow to perform itikaf or prayer in a masjid other than the three holy masajid. So you could make a vow to make itikaf in Masjid Fulani. Not Masjid al-Nabawi, not Masjid al-Nabawi, not Masjid al-Haram, not Masjid al-Aqsa. You said, I'm going to make itikaf in Masjid Fulani. By making it obligatory with a vow. I'm going to pray in Masjid Fulani, another masjid besides those three. Then you can do that, or, he says, to do so in another one. Another masjid besides that one. If the vow was made for one of the three, now you've made a vow for a specific masjid of virtue, because all of the other masjids essentially are the same level of virtue. All of the other masjids are the same in terms of their status. The only masajid that have a unique status are these three. So if you made a vow to perform prayer or itikaf in one of those three, it may be fulfilled there or in one of more virtue. The most virtuous is Masjid al-Haram, Masjid al-Nabi, and Masjid al-Aqsa. So what he's saying here is, if you said, for example, I'm making a vow to perform itikaf in Masjid al-Aqsa, you can certainly fulfill it there, or you could fulfill it in one that's more virtuous. Instead of doing it there, you could fulfill your vow in Masjid al-Nabi or Masjid al-Haram. Your vow would be fulfilled, even though you specified that location. There's nothing else of that. There's no other masjid of that virtue except those that are of greater status, because they share in virtue, right? In terms of the level of reward that is achieved there with the prayers, etc. The other ones not only share in that reward, but there are increased reward. And so, for example, praying and fulfilling the vow in Masjid al-Nabi, then that would fulfill your obligation there. And the same thing goes for if I made the vow from Masjid al-Nabi. I couldn't now downgrade to Masjid al-Aqsa, but I could potentially go to Masjid al-Haram in Mecca to fulfill that obligation. Let's see. Yeah, we're almost there. وَمَنْ اعْتَكَفَ مَنْظُورًا مُتَتَابِعًا لَمْ يَخْرُجْ إِلَّا لِمَا لَا بُدَّ مِنْهُ وَلَا يَعُودُ مَرِيضًا وَلَا يَشْهَدُ جَنَازَةً إِلَّا بِشَرْطٍ ويبطل بالخروج من المشتري لغير عذر وبنية الخروج ولو لم يخرج وبالوطء في الفرج وبالإنزال بالمباشرة دون الفرج وبالردة وبالسكر وحيث بطل وجب استئناف المتتابع غير المقيد بزمن ولا كفارة وإن كان مقيدا بزمن معين استئنافه وعليه كفارة يمين لفوات المحال. Whoever performs a vowed continual itikaf. This is a mutatabi'an, where it's consecutive. A vowed continual itikaf is not to leave except for necessity. Meaning now it's a vow, it's become a mandhur, you've obligated yourself. It's not a recommendation. Remember what we said about recommended acts. You can abandon the recommended act. It's recommended to continue and complete, but you could abandon the recommended act without consequence unless it's a recommended Hajj or Umrah. And this is included in those that are permissible to abandon. But if you made another, it's itikaf mandhur, it's something you vowed, it become an obligation. And so now we're talking about the continual one. It's not to leave except for necessity. You're not allowed to leave to visit the sick nor to attend a funeral unless that was stipulated with your vow. You said, I vow to make itikaf, but if there's a funeral or a sick person, I will go out for that. That wouldn't invalidate your vow. That would be a part of what you're doing. But if you did not, then you could not. It is invalidated by leaving the masjid without excuse. By intending to leave, even without doing so. Right? So just having the intention is enough, much like fasting. The intention for fasting is enough to break it. You can just intend to, I'm no longer fasting. You didn't eat or drink. You said, I don't want to fast anymore. I'm not going to fast. Meaning your intention is, if I had something to drink, I would drink it right now. That's an indication of that a true intent. It is invalidated by leaving not someone that says, I don't want to fast anymore, but they wouldn't actually eat or drink. Like, I'm tired. I don't want to do this anymore. They're just complaining. It's not the same as, literally, I'm looking for something to eat or drink. I can't find it, but if I had it, I would eat or drink. They're basically not fasting anymore. The intention is clear that they're not going to fast. By intending to leave even without doing so. By intercourse or ejaculation through direct touch without penetration. By apostasy or by intoxication. We're highlighting things which would invalidate the itikaf. When invalidated, a continual itikaf not restricted to a specific time must be recommenced and no expiation is due. If it was restricted to a specific time, it must be recommenced and an expiation for breaking an oath it's required due to the lapse of the appointed time. So here he's pointing out something, how you would handle a continual itikaf, meaning you've obligated a stretch of time, days. You said, I'm going to make an itikaf, or I've taken an oath or a vow that I will make an itikaf for, let's say, 10 days. So there's a one in which is done, which is not specific to time. So it's open-ended, meaning you could end up doing those 10 days at any point in the year. I'm going to make 10 days itikaf, nadran. It could be any 10 days. Or you make an oath which is fixed to a time. Once Muharram comes in, or once whatever time, from 10 days, from that date until the end, I've now specified the time period. So these are two different versions of this obligation. So the first version, which is not time-based, time-specific, if you were to invalidate your itikaf, you would only need to recommence, meaning you would need to start over in order to make that consecutive time period. And there would be nothing else to be done. You still have to fulfill it, but you just start over another 10 days. But if you said, I want these particular 10 days, these 10 days specifically, and then you invalidated the itikaf, he's saying here that it not only must it be recommenced, meaning you have to start over to fulfill the 10 days, but now there is an expiation that must be paid because you've broken a part of the vow which had to do with the specificity of the time. Because you can't, you missed it now. It's not like you can come back, you can't rewind the days. Well, let's go back 5 days. You specified it for now. This Ramadan, at this time, I'm going to start. So what do? You have to pay kaffārat al-yamīn for breaking that continuity. Kaffārat al-yamīn means you have to feed 10 poor people or clothe them or fast 3 days. The last section he says, وَلَا يَبْطُلُ إِنْ خَرَجَ مِنَ الْمَسْجِدِ لِبَوْلٍ أَوْ غَائِطٍ أو إتيان بمأكل ومشرب أو لجمعة تلزمه أو طهارة واجبة ونحو ذلك ويسن تشاغله بالقرب واجتناب ما لا يعنيه ويحرم جعل القرآن بدلا من الكلام وينبغي لمن قصد المسجد أن ينوي الاعتكاف مدة لبثه فيه. It is not invalidated by leaving the masjid to relieve oneself, bring food or drink, attend Jum'ah when it is obligatory, perform an obligatory purification, or the like. It is recommended to occupy oneself with acts of devotion and avoid what does not concern him. It is forbidden to make recitation of the Quran a substitute for ordinary speech. It is also recommended that whoever enters the masjid intend itikaf for the duration of his stay. Okay, just talking about wrapping up some points here, pulling everything in together to make some conclusions. When it's invalidated, etc., when it's not. So if you have to use the restroom and obviously you're going to leave the masjid to do that. If you have to perform some type of purification, wudu or ghusl, then you're going to have to leave. That's not invalidated. You're going to do that, etc. Again, we're talking about making itikaf in a masjid that has the daily prayers. If you're obligated but might not have the Jummah, you'd have to leave. And by leaving, it's not going to invalidate your itikaf. And then back to the point about what you should do, he says recommending various acts of devotion, avoiding things that are of no benefit or of no substance, nothing to do with you. And then mentions a point here, وَيَحْرُمُ جَعْلَ الْقُرْآنِ بَدْلًا مِنَ الْكَلَامِ. It's forbidden to make the Quran a substitute for your speech, in which you try and talk to people by reciting verses. You use verses of the Quran instead of actually talking. So you want to get a thought across, and you have a verse you can quote that would get that thought across. It's also recommended that whoever enters the masjid intend to itikaf for the duration of the stay, which would be something like what we're doing right now. Right? If you're going to stay in the masjid, if it's more than just passing through, you can make itikaf. Your intention can be made to make itikaf for a period of time. It doesn't have to be a day and a night. It doesn't have to be all day long. It can be for any significant portion of time. Make an itikaf for 30 minutes or an hour or 2 hours or more. So, when you come here to hang out at the masjid, whether it's going to sit and read Quran, whether you're going to sit for a lesson, or you're going to stay between prayers, then adding to the reward by intending itikaf is recommended. All right, and that's where we're going to wrap up for the day. Jazakallah khair wa sallallahu wa sallam ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa akhir da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.